thank you again, Mary. And we will go over to Harvey, to Dr. Harvey Osborne, who heads up the small but perfectly formed history department at University College Suffolk. Now, Harvey is going to be kind of returning to a long-standing kind of interest and obsession of his, indeed, kind of one of the main kind of foci for his his PhD thesis, thinking about salmon, both as kind of an object of kind of conservation and as kind of a source of no little kind of resistance in Victorian Britain. So, Harvey, if you've got over your earlier technical problems, we'd very much like to hear your paper, The Changing Meaning of Salmon, Environmental Crisis and Social Conflict in Victorian Britain.
Yes, thank you, Carl. Can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Right, wonderful. Well, first of all, thanks to Mary for saving me by going first, and also apologies to the audience, really, because I did have a rather beautiful PowerPoint to show you, but which has decided to corrupt itself, really. So if it's okay with you, I will kind of give the paper and I will try and draw pictures in your mind, if possible, to replace the ones that I had. Anyway, as Carl suggested, my paper is on the changing meaning of salmon, environmental crisis and social conflict in Victorian Britain. I don't know why I subtitled my paper Victorian Britain, slightly disingenuous perhaps. Some of you could ask for your money back because most of my focus will be on England and Wales, although I will refer to Scotland and Ireland in passing. Okay, the Atlantic salmon and the salmon fisheries in the Victorian period. Why should we be interested in such things? Well, firstly, the fate of the salmon offers a good example of anthropogenic impacts on the natural environment in the age of industrialization and agricultural improvement. Secondly, salmon fisheries were historically a valuable part of the rural economy in parts of Great Britain and an important source of income for landowners and other riparian interests. And I'm talking here mainly about income derived from commercial net fisheries, although income from angling, sporting rights later becomes important in some areas, and Annie Tinley, who is talking later today, has written about both these things in the context of the River Helmsdale on the Sutherland estate. Thirdly, a decline in salmon numbers led from the 1860s to the introduction of legislation, state-directed conservation efforts aimed at preserving fish stocks. And this legal and regulatory regime was underpinned by what at the time were expert understandings of the salmon's life cycle derived from practical natural science, and legitimized by the policy aim of increasing the supply of a valuable article of food for the benefit of the public. However, these efforts, this legislation of the 1860s and 1870s, known collectively as the Salmon Acts, also circumscribed certain customary and popular practices of fishing. They became illegal. And unlike the conflict over the game laws, about which we know quite a lot, we know less, to quote Carl Griffin and Ian Robertson, about efforts to regulate and restrict customary usage in the interests of conservation and the conflicts that resulted. So in the time that I have, I will say something about the commercial exploitation of the salmon, the decline in salmon stocks in the 19th century, the causes of this decline, the response of the state, and then something about the poaching conflict stimulated by new laws protecting salmon. And finally, perhaps something about the changing meaning of salmon from kind of mundane food stuff to esteemed luxury and exclusive sport fish. The exploitation of the Atlantic salmon as a food source has a long history in the British Isles. At one point, probably, but most British rivers contained salmon, although from the late medieval period, the fish was increasingly restricted to the relatively unobstructed rivers of Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and southwestern and northern England, and also parts of the south of England, including the Thames and the southern chalk streams. Inland fishing rights were historically a valuable form of property, with riparian rights usually possessed as an extension of adjoining property rights over land, although sometimes they could be held independently. In England and Wales, and Ireland at least, public rights for fishing also existed in tidal waters, and under some circumstances, exclusive private rights too. Although the precise timing of the annual migratory runs varied according to individual rivers, adult salmon returned to freshwater to breed any time between early spring and autumn, and commercial fishing focused on salmon freshly returned from the sea, and it ceased before the winter breeding season when the physical condition and also the palatability of the adult fish also deteriorated. There is a plethora of evidence highlighting just how plentiful this seasonal harvest was up until the late 18th century. Daniel Defoe reported in the 1720s that the Tamar in Devon was so full of fresh salmon that the country people cannot take too many. In 1785, the naturalist Benjamin Martin observed that the River Mersey, believe it or not, greatly abounds with salmon, enough to supply demand in Manchester, Warrington, Stockport, with the surplus sent to Birmingham and London by stage. The seasonal abundance of the salmon at this time was also reflected in its relatively modest retail price, which rarely exceeded 1.5 to 4 pence per pound in the 18th century, and even into the early 19th century. The salmon was eaten by all social classes, particularly in areas close to productive rivers. The large quantities of fish being landed, despite the low unit price, is reflected in the historic value of some fisheries. On the Cumberland Derwent, 2 miles of fishery possessed at the time by the Kerwin family of Workington had a rental value of £300 a year in the 1680s. And as late as the early 1800s, single fishing traps on the Herefordshire Wye and Hampshire Avon were returning annual rentals of £400 per annum. Most commercial fisheries on the larger rivers were net and boat fisheries. And at this point, I would have shown you a nice picture of some men working what looks like a kind of small drift net, really, both from a boat and on the shore. So most fisheries were net and boat fisheries involving mobile and manually hauled drift nets. And on most rivers also, there were usually various forms of what were called fixed engines. That is to say, permanent traps used for catching salmon. And I very much regret that I cannot show you a very nice photograph of some salmon traps, or coops as they are called, that were based at Corby Castle on the River Eden in Cumberland. And what these traps, these fixed engines, these coops look like, although there are plenty of other examples of these things throughout the British Isles, but the coops at Corby Castle effectively are kind of boxes, really, with a grill on the front into which the salmon run and in which they're trapped. Having said that, although the extent and precise timing of the fall off varied slightly from river to river, salmon populations in the rivers of England and Wales began to collapse over the first half of the 19th century, most strongly discernible between about 1820 and 1850. The retail price of the formerly cheap salmon increased more than fourfold over this period, and by the 1860s it was said that a large salmon could be as valuable as a South Downs sheep. The rising cost of the fish reflected falling catches. On the Hampshire Avon, the annual salmon catch collapsed from just under 12,000 fish in 1816 to only 68 in 1860. On the Lune in Lancashire, the annual value of the salmon taken at the Skirton fishery dropped from 1,000 in 1832 to only 300 in 1859, which is a big decline in fish numbers given the compensatory impact of rising retail prices. Sustained falls in catches inevitably led to a corresponding decline in the value of inland fisheries. The Kingsgarth fishery on the River Eden in Cumberland, which had been let for £845 a year in 1781, was attracting only £55 a year in 1850. On the River Tees in the northeast, the rental value of inland fisheries dropped by 75% or more during the 1840s and 1850s. By the beginning of the 1860s, the financial value of inland salmon fishing rights had fallen to such a low ebb in many areas, that it was said that they increasingly ceased to be an important element in the value of private property. In 1860, following lobbying from fishery interests, the Royal Commission to inquire into the salmon fisheries of England and Wales was established. And significantly, the Commission and the legislation that followed presented the fisheries, which were almost entirely privately held, as an issue of national interest, whose recovery would increase food supply for the benefit of the public. Following an 8-month investigation, following inquiries along all the major salmon rivers of England and Wales, the Commission identified around 8 systematic and often interlinked causes of the salmon's decline. This included the destruction of habitat by various forms of pollution and the spread of obstructions to salmon migration, mainly in the form of impassable mill dams and weirs. Washings from coal mines were particularly destructive in mining areas, but actually it was impassable dams and weirs which were really the things that had an insidious impact over time on salmon populations, since they prevented salmon accessing the full range of inland spawning areas. And at this point, I was going to show you a rather kind of pointless picture of a dam that a salmon couldn't get over, but I'm sure you can imagine such a thing. Over-exploitation by commercial fishing interests was certainly also an issue, and something that the Royal Commission identified. And there appears to have been an increase in fishing effort and effectiveness from the late 18th century. This was in various ways associated with new technologies, new ways of fishing, including new forms of permanent netting stations called stake nets, permanent nets which ran out into the sea, really, from the mouths of rivers. These tended to intercept fish at the mouths of rivers even before they entered freshwater proper, and they were introduced first on the Solway Firth in the 1780s. Again, I did have a picture of a stake net, and I regret that I cannot share that with you. Although the commissioners did not perceive it as a primary threat in the 1860s, they also received testimony from very thoughtful local witnesses on the impact of agricultural improvement. The enclosure and drainage of moorland in many upland areas had resulted in greater extremes in hydro flow and in river levels. Unimproved uplands had in the past, as one witness put it, acted like a sponge for rainfall. But once drains were cut, water was released off the land faster, with floods scouring out the river gravel beds where the salmon spawned. And with the water also came increased siltation and residues of the lime and guano used to bring reclaimed soils into cultivation. And this had implications, as many kind of observant witnesses noticed, for the wider ecology of the upper tributaries, the salmon nurseries. The Commission, the Royal Commission of 1860-61, and the witnesses before it, however, placed rather more emphasis on the damaging impact of illegal fishing, poaching, which was reported to be endemic in some areas, where upper tributaries cut through upland farming communities. Popular exploitation of the salmon had long been practiced without really any significant interference, and small freeholders, small tenant farmers often regarded fishing as a natural extension of their property or tenurial rights, even if it was in violation, strictly speaking, of existing fishery law. And even in areas where private riparian rights were very clearly established, these exclusive rights of fishing were said to have been upheld with increased laxity during the 1850s, particularly as the commercial value of the fisheries dwindled. In some areas, the failure of riparian owners to repel trespassers was said to have led the public to assert a kind of right to fish in waters which were at one point unquestionably private. Plebeian fishing practices were doubly condemned, since they typically focused on 2 stages of the salmon's life cycle, potentially critical to the reproductive capacity of the fisheries. Firstly, The immature salmon parr, small salmon, were netted for immediate consumption or sale. And second, the adult fish were killed with purpose-designed salmon spears, often known as lacers, as they congregated in the shallow waters of the spawning grounds during the winter months. And a lacer is rather like a trident, really. Numerous witnesses describe the practice of blazing the waters with nocturnal spearing parties using primitive torches to illuminate and lure the spawning fish. And at this point, I did have a rather romantic image, if you like, of men in a river with these kind of tridents with blazing straw torches. The recommendations of the Royal Commission formed the basis of the 1861 Salmon Act, later supplemented by the Salmon Act of 1865. And for the sake of time, really, I'm going to talk in particular about two aspects of the new legislation, which had implications for customary fishing practices. The 1861 Salmon Act banned the use and possession of the salmon spear. We've described this implement, also known as the lacer or waster, and it also banned the use of any light for the purpose of catching salmon, again to try and repel these nocturnal attacks, if you like, on the spawning grounds. Now, this represented a practical attempt to check the killing of spawning fish, but it also reflected shifting attitudes towards such rudimentary and primitive hunting instruments. The spear had been a traditional and socially accepted mode of taking salmon in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland up until the early decades of the 19th century. And it had been formally lauded, actually, late 18th, early 19th century, by writers such as Thomas Stoddart as manly and vigorous sport. Lacering is also celebrated in the novels of Sir Walter Scott. However, by mid-century at least, lacering, spearing salmon was the focus of mounting criticism, heightened by growing sensitivity to its destructive power on diminishing salmon stocks and its increasingly plebeian associations. Changes in the law were, however, largely futile without effective supervision and enforcement on the riverbank. This was eventually realised through the 1865 Salmon Act, which provided for the creation of local conservancy boards throughout England and Wales, with authority over fishery districts whose boundaries encompassed entire watersheds. The boards, comprised of magistrates and riparian owners, were invested with Crown authority to raise revenue through the imposition of rates and licence duties on fishery owners and fishermen. One of the most immediate effects of the new boards was that they introduced systematic policing of salmon rivers. Prior to 1865, policing and enforcement of fishery law, where it had occurred at all, had largely depended on the commitment of private individuals and angling associations. With the advent of conservancy boards, bailiffs were employed with jurisdiction across whole river systems, and typically 80% of the revenue raised by boards went towards the employment of bailiffs. Between 1872 and 1890, the number of these bailiffs patrolling salmon rivers in England and Wales increased from about 195 to 383. And their numbers were also bolstered by the recruitment of honorary water bailiffs, who were usually private gamekeepers employed by landowners whose property included fisheries. There was also a great deal more cooperation after 1861 between fishery interests and county police forces. Summary prosecutions under the Salmon Acts, published in the annual judicial statistics, provide some indication of where conflict between policing authorities and local populations became most common after 1861. Between 1862 and 1892, there were just under 18,000 prosecutions under the Salmon Acts in England and Wales, the vast majority recorded in a relatively small number of counties in northern, southwestern England and mid and north Wales. The county with by far the highest number of cases during this period was Cumberland, followed by Northumberland, Devon, Breconshire, Durham and Carmarthenshire. Cumberland has about 3,000 of those 18,000 cases in all. Northumberland, Devon and Breconshire have about 1,500. There were lesser but still significant numbers of prosecutions in Lancashire, Cardiganshire, West Yorkshire, Glamorganshire, Westmoreland. And the explanations for the geographic distribution of these prosecutions are on an ecological level quite straightforward. Counties with significant numbers of cases contained rivers in which the salmon still survived, really, still persisted. But beyond this, explanations for why prosecutions were so heavily concentrated in a handful of English and Welsh counties becomes slightly more complex. But again, environmental features mattered. Those rivers, or those counties rather, those counties where prosecutions were highest tended to contain rivers whose physical dimensions provided practical opportunities to poach. And the proximity of population settlements was a compounding factor. Higher than normal levels of poaching was predictable where communities of agricultural or industrial workers were situated close to the spawning grounds in the headwaters or other features of a river suited to basic methods of poaching. The spatial distribution of prosecutions provides a pretty accurate indication of the geography of salmon-based conflict after 1861, although clearly committals only provide some pointers to real levels of offending. Nonetheless, trends in prosecution also tell us something about the longer term trajectory of salmon poaching conflict. Prosecutions peaked nationally in 1887 at 817 cases. About 156 of those were related to Cumberland alone, I beg your pardon. And thereafter, committals in all areas experienced a sustained decline, which appeared to have continued into the early 1900s.
Harvey, can I ask you to move towards summing up?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
How much time have I got, or no time?
If as quickly as you can.
Okay, no problem at all. I think I'd like just to say something by way of comment on the situation in Cumberland, which has this very high level of prosecutions. And by and large, that is a product of a combination of factors, which is rivers which are physically suited for poaching, and a proliferation of rural industrial centres. So if I was to explain why Cumberland has more prosecutions than almost any other area, or more salmon-based conflict than almost any other area in the late Victorian period, it's all about the kind of combination of population and their proximity to spawning beds. Mid Wales is also another area where there is an awful lot of salmon-based conflict, but there are less prosecutions actually, because in some ways the forces of law and order find it harder to act against Rebeccaite salmon poachers. I will sum up in a paragraph in a way by suggesting that in broad terms, it might be possible to suggest that the Salmon Acts possibly halted the demise of the salmon in parts of England and Wales, but they did not prevent a continuing overall decline in wild salmon populations, which reasserted itself from the mid-1890s. And this decline was accompanied by a fall in the numbers employed in commercial fishing. The purported policy of restoring the salmon as a ubiquitous public foodstuff was not realised. However, the continuing scarcity of the wild Atlantic salmon during the latter part of the 19th century was probably a contributing factor in the fish's, I guess, eventual progression, really, in terms of its meaning from commodified nature as foodstuff to a socially exclusive sport fishing icon. Thank you, Carl.